All right, well, let's get started. Hello and welcome. It's great to see you all here today. Welcome to the virtual colloquium series In Conversation, Arts and Culture for Well-Being, organized by the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is James Pawelski, and I'm Professor of Practice and Director of Education in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and the founding director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us live and to those who are watching the recorded version of today's event. The mission of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is to understand, assess, and advance the well-being benefits of engagement in arts and culture, focusing on individual and collective human flourishing. We're grateful for support from the Chris and Sasha Heinz Family Foundation, the Heinz Endowments, and the National Endowment for the Arts, which has designated the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project as an NEA research lab and is supportive both of practice-informed research and of research-informed practice in the arts, culture, and well-being. You can find out much more about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, including our publications and how to sign up for our newsletter on our website, which Sarah will be popping in the chat. Thank you, Sarah, www.humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org. Today, we are thrilled to continue with our colloquium series, which features presentations by and discussions between scientists and practitioners on topics concerning the arts, culture, and well-being. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers for today, let me preview the plan for this colloquium. We will begin by hearing two 20-minute presentations, one focusing on science and one focusing on practice. Then I will moderate a brief discussion with the speakers before opening it up to a Q&A with all of you. At any point during the session, feel free to enter questions or comments in the chat. If you would like to share these verbally, please wait until we open it up for audience participation toward the end of our time together, and then we will invite you to raise your Zoom hand. With that, let's turn to our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pablo Tinio. Dr. Tinio is a professor and head of the Creativity and Aesthetics Lab at Montclair State University. He has conducted research in and published scholarly works with museums such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Queen's Museum, among other institutions in the United States and Europe. Dr. Tinio has been awarded the Frank X. Barron Award and the Daniel E. Berlin Award for Outstanding Early Career Achievement in Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. This award by the American Psychological Association and the Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Field by an Early Career Scientist from the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics. Pablo, it's terrific to have you with us today. I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Let me bring up my slides. Are y'all able to see them or see the first one?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here. I'd just like to thank our host for inviting myself and Dennis to have this conversation. So today I'm going to talk about research that my colleague Zorana Ivcevic from Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, research that we've done recently at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. This is part of a larger project. So I'm presenting some of the results from that first study. And I'm going to give some background regarding empirical aesthetics, which is the field that I'm part of, and I think a number of you as well in the audience. So empirical aesthetics is essentially a study of how not how we view things, but not just artworks and art objects and artifacts, things in general, like design objects, furniture in your homes, of landscapes, scenes, faces as well. But my focus in the research that I do is really visual arts, right? And empirical aesthetics in terms of visual arts is one of the second oldest field in psychology, second to psychophysics, actually. And this field was founded in the late 1800s by G.T. Fechner. And so we've been doing research over a century, for over a century. That much of that research has focused on three things, really. One, how features of artworks impact viewers of those artworks. So, for example, things like symmetry, complexity, contour, size, even, right? The second is how viewer characteristics influence art experience. Viewer characteristics could be the personality traits, the amount of knowledge they have about art, training that they've received in art. So, for example, if you're trained in studio art or any other like art history, so any other field in the world of art, right? If you have that knowledge, how does that impact how you now experience art in a museum or at home or anywhere? And then the third sort of characteristic and focus is how people respond and the way they respond, right? Like whether it's liking, interest, preference for different types of art. And traditionally, we've categorized the representational versus abstract art. That's the most popular sort of type of study in empirical aesthetics. So all these things have led to amazing findings in the field, but we've also really focused on just sort of the basic things, like how much do you like a painting? How interesting do you find it? Whether you prefer this painting over another painting. And there's been a movement in the field over the last, I would say, like decade and a half towards looking beyond, right, liking and interest and preference, and trying to characterize the more meaningful aspects of art. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, like more meaningful aspects. And a lot of this push has been really it's from the reinvigoration of the field recently in the last 10 years due to neuroaesthetics. A lot of you have read things about neuroaesthetics, debates about aesthetic emotions. So, for example, the emotions we feel when looking at a painting, is that different from other types of emotions, right? In other contexts. And then, of course, relevant to this in conversation session is art and well-being, right? There's been a little bit more focus on those topics and using different methodologies as well. So that's the background. It's probably more than you wanted to know about empirical aesthetics, but I wanted to set our project in context. So all of these things, over a century's worth of research, vast scholarship, we really, in general, have yet to capture the most meaningful aspects of art experiences. And by meaningful, we're talking about, let's see, hold on, for some reason. Okay, there. We're talking about thoughts and insights, for example, that we have when walking out of a museum. Jeff Smith, who was a guest here a few months ago, I believe, in his book, The Museum Effect, he talked about like the sense of encounter after seeing meaningful work of art. And really, it's the question of when you walk into a museum, right? Let's say it's the Metropolitan or any museum, the Barnes Foundation in Philly. How are you different when you walk out, right, from when you walked in? So how did your thinking change? Do you feel as if your mind has expanded? Do you feel a little bit more in tune with the world? Do you feel a little bit more in tune with yourself, right? Did you think about others in your life and so forth? So these are the things that we were trying to capture in our research. We were not really interested in how much you like something or whether you preferred one thing over another, right? We were looking for those profound experiences that we believe is why we go into museums. It's why art is so ubiquitous in our lives. So that's the essentially the question, right? What are those things that we haven't captured yet in the research that we've done over the years? So we are drawing on two theoretical frameworks. The first is aesthetic cognitivism. This is coming from philosophy, and the main claim of aesthetic cognitivism is the value of art is really in its ability to enhance our understanding of ourselves, our ability to understand and think about the human condition, and our ability to think about moral and spiritual concepts. So all those kind of big things that people associate with the experience of art, aesthetic cognitism talks about it, and also we talk about it in our daily lives when we talk about, oh, I saw this show at the museum, this exhibit, and I saw this piece, and it really, my gosh, it reminded me of like, and so on and on. Those kinds of things we really haven't been able to capture, and that's the point of the project. And we're also drawing on the mirror model of art, and this is a model I proposed in 2013, and it argues that the aesthetic viewing, that experience, that process mirrors in reverse the art making process. And we're going to take painting as an example. Most paintings, and we know this from studies on how artists paint, they begin with an underdrawing. And even prior to this, artists make sketches, they make studies and so forth. They have piles of paper, right? Little sketches on what they want to depict and put into the painting. So it begins with, they initiate the process with the underdrawing, typically on canvas. This kind of marks like the structure of the painting and so forth. And then they develop that underdrawing. It's essentially putting more layers on top of it, whether that is paint, whether that is more sketches, making the outlines a little bit more visible, starting to put some more materials. And then they work on this, and it's, artists, many would say like the work is never finished, but when they get to what seems like the finished piece, the layers have already built up. And on the surface are those features that are quite basic in terms of how we perceive them, like contour, color, right, contrast, and all those things. Now, if we take this painting and imagine being in a museum and looking at it, as the art perceiver, we're actually reverse engineering it, right? We know from perception studies that the first things we come into contact with, the first things we process, are actually the last things that the artist put down, right? Contrast, color. And we do this in milliseconds, seconds, if not milliseconds. When we give it more time, as we now engage with the piece, memory kicks in, memory processes. Now we have this tendency to try to make sense of it, try to recognize objects, even in abstract works. If you've ever stood in front of a huge canvas of like a Pollock or purely abstract piece, sometimes you're like, oh, look, that looks like a face, or that looks like a mountain in the background. Is that a mountain? But it might not be there, but we have that tendency to look for things that we know, right? Things that are familiar. If we give it even more time, all right, then we start asking questions about, I wonder why the artist did this. I wonder what the motivation was behind this piece. I wonder what they were feeling when they were making this and what their life was like. So the mirror model essentially argues that it is that kind of peeling back of layers during that art experience. And then at some point, if we give it time, and time is essential, and attention, obviously, then we get to the point where the artist started, right? And that's kind of like the idea of the mirror model. And what we believe in the research that we did is like why we're using the mirror model as a foundation for the work is that this is key for the most meaningful and the profound experiences of art, right? That mirroring process is important because if we just kind of breeze by a piece and say, I like that, that looks good, that's interesting, we never fully get to the point where we're now having, and this is, I'm being provocative here, I apologize. We're having a conversation with the artist through the work. Whether it's a one-to-one match, right, between what the artist said and what we felt, or we got out of that work, that's a question. But we've shown that there, in a study we did, a previous study at the Whitney, there is that correspondence. So We wanted to characterize perceivers' lived experiences of personally meaningful artworks in a museum. We're looking for those meaningful, profound experiences. We did a study at the Whitney Museum of American Art last fall and early this spring this year. Collected the data, analyzed the data, essentially 4 exhibits during that time. And Hopper was the big one, right? We had 4 exhibits, but Hopper was the one that people came to see. At least I would say 75% of the time that when we were there at the Whitney. Of course, there was also their permanent collection and 2 other exhibitions. One in particular was so interesting is Puerto Rican artists essentially exhibiting works that had a theme of the aftermath of the Hurricane Maria a few years ago, where there was so much destruction. So we did, I'm not going to go through all the details of the method. I'm just 70 visitors. What we wanted to do is to have them, instead of us showing you a picture or asking you to stand in front of a painting that we thought you might like, right? We actually had them pick a painting after they walked around a bit, picked a painting that they found personally meaningful and that might be relevant to their lives at that moment. We used the Think Aloud protocol. And that is when you stand in front of the work and we just ask you to think aloud, and we actually have a prompt for that. Let's see if oops, did I miss the prompt? Yeah, here's the prompt. I would like for you to look at this artwork and approach or view it as you normally would. And again, they're standing in front of the work. At the same time, please describe what makes it meaningful to you by talking into the audio recording device. Please try and be as specific and detailed as possible when describing your thought process and experience when looking at the work. And as they were doing this, the researcher was next to them, but not like on top of it. They're just quite near. If they needed to do prompts to keep the conversation going or to think alouds going, they would do that. They were also holding a microphone that recorded everything that they were saying, everything that they were thinking out loud. So those data were analyzed using thematic coding. Essentially, again, if you want to know more about how we did it, feel free to reach out to me. I can send you the protocol for analyzing that set of data. So it was many read-throughs. We coded for patterns that were common across the 70 Think Aloud 70 visitors. And then we came up with 5 from that set of data. These 5 overarching themes emerged. Self and life history, others in the world, artists in the creative process, aesthetic stance and aesthetic narrative, and art techniques and materials. So these are, again, overarching themes. Below these are kind of sub-themes. And it's important to note that we didn't impose any of these on the data analysis. We didn't have any concepts that we wanted to find. It was these emerged from the data with the think alouds from the visitors at the Whitney Museum. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time because there's a lot of text on these slides, but we're going to go quickly. So the first theme is self and life history. I'm going to pick out personal meaning and connection to life history. So this was a piece by the artist Motley Jr. And a visitor was looking at this and talked about like meaning and what sort of thoughts came to mind. And the visitor said, it reminds me of summer nights in a way, just like everyone's just chilling, good vibes. It reminds me of the park when old people danced around the park and the nights and the stars. And that's why I was kind of drawn to this painting, because I have good memories of that in this city. Yeah, it reminds me of when I was young and summer nights with my family in the city and the most memorable, fun stuff, just talking, eating, chilling, people watching. So quite positive response to this, thinking about past life, right, with relatives having a good time. This sub-theme, learning and a new way of seeing, inspiration and transformation, intellectual humility. This is a piece by McDonald Wright. I think any piece of art tells you in part how the artist sees the world at that moment. And so it's often like, I think what it tells you is something elemental about yourself or about other people. they see it this way. I see it differently. You know, the more you look at it, the more things you see. Like I see a rainbow in there now that I think originally I didn't, because we've been looking at it for 5 minutes and I'm like, oh, wait, where are all the other little things that I haven't seen? So I do definitely appreciate like just the ability to look at something for a prolonged period of time and see more. And I think humans are like that too, right? The more opportunity to connect with them, the more we see. Um, and I'm going to give you a few moments to look at this piece. This is by McNeely. Okay. The the visitor talked about when I first passed by the work, my first reaction actually was that it made me really uncomfortable. And I wasn't sure what the intention was meant to be of the really kind of aggressive depiction of it was hard to tell even at first whether it was pleasure or pain. And I kind of walked around and just moved away from it at first because I wasn't sure whether I liked that feeling. And then as I was doing my second pass by, I was kind of just curious why did that give me such a strong reaction? And I didn't really inspect it carefully to try and think through. So I read the blurb, and I'm actually an OBGYN. I'm training to provide abortion care, and I don't see a lot of contents about getting abortions, providing abortions, really anything. And I think that was for me a really powerful example of how taking everything in context, the way that's presented really opened up space for me to engage more with the art. And looking at it after reading the blurb, I feel like I was more comfortable to spend time in front of some of this really uncomfortable imagery and sort of feel more empathy and sort of also like hopelessness, but more in a human connected way as opposed to an alienating way. So I'm going to go back to that image now that we've read that statement. And it's important to kind of try to imagine as well the visitors talking about this as they're standing in front of it. So now we're so removed from that situation that it's often difficult to get a sense of how they were feeling. And this individual, if you listen to their voice, it was really kind of they were really disturbed. And then there was this sort of, they talked about the aha moment when they realized why they were so uncomfortable with the imagery. So I'm gonna go through the second main theme. And we're not gonna go through all of them. I have slides that I'm gonna skip over just for the sake of maintaining, staying within the time. This is relationships with and connection to others. And the visitors that looking at this piece by Archer, sorry. There's an emotional attraction that reminds me of my son when he was younger, and we would share his head, and there's vulnerability to that and such a buoyancy to it. It reminds me of my son, who is now grown, and there's times that'll never come back. And trying to protect them and then they grow up and you're still trying to protect them, and they don't want you to. All right. So kind of this being a parent, right? And then kids wanting to do their own thing. And this is a piece by Hopper called Boy in the Moon. It reminds me of my oldest grandson who's now 11, but I don't think he's probably ever had a dream that was that interesting. So the pictures looks like it's a dream, boy having a dream. But I wish he did, and I wish I had. I always had anxiety dreams. But to me, it's sort of like that's the dream. That's the way of sleeping that a little boy should, and the dreams that they should look out on. It reminded me of that the dreams of children are usually more anxiety laden than this adventurous. Um, so I'm gonna skip a little bit to actually this piece here with by Baez. So this is an interesting installation. It's pictures from childhood of family. And what Baez did, the artist, is she took red string and connected the pictures like right through the needle went right through the pictures and created these intricate patterns of string. So for example, in the lower right, uh, picture of dad and daughter, right? And it's kind of weird looking at it because you could imagine the needle going through the eyes, which we would never do in a photograph. And this is what the viewer talked about. I'm looking at someone's very personal experience with their family, and I think they don't say it directly in the description over there in the art, but they do kind of allude to the fact that her father, who committed suicide just shy of the anniversary of Hurricane Maria. I just I think it means something to me. I think because I have an interesting relationship with my own father. And this she talks about it. I guess in the description over there, they talk about how for her, this meant sort of trying to reconstruct a broken relationship after he had already been gone. And I think it's very on the nose, this art in a lot of ways, but I don't think that takes away from its meaning or what it can do to a person. And this is like as personal as it gets, obviously, like your childhood photos of her family. Um, so I'll go back now to the overarching themes. And of course, we didn't really talk about the art techniques and materials, and aesthetic stance and aesthetic narrative. There will be a paper reporting these findings in detail, right? You can get all the quotations. But what we wanted to do again is kind of try to capture the profound and meaningful experiences. And in particular, because we're using the mirror model as a basis for what we're doing, um, we were, although we weren't kind of trying to prove it, trying to look for it in the data in the think alouds, we did find a lot of instances where visitors, as they were standing in front of the works, they were kind of thinking about and wondering and asking questions about how the work was made, questions about the artist's life, ideas, intentions, and motivation as they were trying to understand that piece and make meaning out of it. Some curious findings from the research. Nighthawks, as you know, is the most famous Hopper painting. It wasn't there during the retrospective, so people were really angry. So WTF happened to Nighthawks was one comment that was just so powerful. Like person pretty much screamed it during a think aloud. I swear it's just a bunch of hipsters in charge around here. A person who was upset as how the exhibition was laid out. And then this one man, he said, looking at a painting, there's been some defining moments in my life when I saw a bench. And he was looking at a painting of a bench, someone sitting on a bench. And then he talked about how in his life that the bench was actually an important part of his life during important moments. So back to the overall question of meaningful aspects of experiences of art. We really believe that the mirroring process through during art engagement is key. We believe that if people are given time, and in a way, sometimes scaffolding, and museums do this quite well, um, they scaffold that experience with information about when the piece was sort of the genesis of an art piece, when it was created, who created it. But actually, the more information we give, um, the more tools the visitor has to interpret that piece. And of course, time is key. You got to give people time to slow down and really engage with a piece beyond just looking at what's depicted, and to get them to ask those questions that lead to answers, right, for them. So I just want to thank you all for listening. My collaborator here is Zorana Ivcevic, couldn't join us. And I wanted to thank, of course, our research team, Cameron, left to right, Cameron, Christine, and Zandali, who did the data collection at the Whitney Museum the fall and spring of this year. So thank you all. And of course, research was funded by Templeton Religious Trust, and thanks to the Whitney as well.
Terrific. Thank you, Pablo. That was really fascinating. What a terrific process you used, combining the theory and then the creative data gathering, and a lot of work to go through all of that data that you gathered. Terrific. Thank you. We look forward to exploring that a little bit further later on in our session. But first, I next want to introduce our second speaker. And our second speaker is Dennis Robinson. He's a leader in the arts and culture sectors of the Philadelphia area and a thought-provoking artist himself. Dennis exhibits a dedicated passion for creating enriching experiences that often include history, culture, and arts and interpretation, and to which he brings a wealth of experience as a Philadelphia native. Dennis works with various organizations such as Historic Philadelphia Incorporated, the Barnes Foundation, and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, where he is currently engaged. Dennis, welcome. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, James. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Let's get started here. Hopefully we can all see this here. Okay. All right, so good morning, good morning. Like James has mentioned, my name is Dennis Robinson. I am the Visitor Experience Supervisor here at PAFA. And I really wanted to start this presentation with two main points that I thought were very, very important to me. And they came up quite frequently as I thought about my inclusion in this conversation. And one of the things that I kept drawing back to is the notion of community experience, but also what I like to title Paintings That Open Doors. And we have a painting by Salvador Dali. It's untitled Door with Trompe-l'oeil. And so just thinking about how the arts have impacted me personally as someone who's maybe not been so privileged in experiencing art education at a young age. And so I thought this was very passionate perspective that I wanted to share. And so, you know, as a Philadelphia native, as James mentioned, I really like to start by contextualizing Philadelphia's rich cultural history. So we have a number of beautiful things here. Philadelphia is obviously well known for its murals, its beautiful music, of which there are many musicians that are not pictured here, and an architecture and history as well. And so Philadelphia captures such a wealth of beautiful aesthetics and history and culture. It's a wealth of information here that we all intersect with and we walk past every single day. And so these things have, over the course of my life thus far, these things have shaped my experiences and my perspectives and outlook in life, even without having the more traditional fine arts experiences. And so I wanted to highlight these particular, just some of the important elements of Philadelphia's rich history that have still managed to be very impactful to me and really shaping a more holistic view that I have in the world. Okay, but I also like to, you know, bring up an important conversation. I love having a very productive conversation. And so in that, I think about the barriers that we are often really experiencing, whether we're dealing with cultural institutions or a variety of different challenges or hurdles. And so I have a few quotes here by Dr. Pablo Tinio himself. He's done a number of incredible presentations where he talks a lot about creativity and some of the barriers within creativity. And so I'll just read two of the quotes that we have here. Creativity is an important symbol of moving forward. It's important to figure out what stops creativity from happening and how to avoid it. Secondly, figuring out how to promote it for everyone, including those who do not believe they can be creative. They do not have to imitate Picasso. They don't have to imitate Steve Jobs. And the other quote here is, one of the things that distances people from art is the opinion that it's all creative, and it's really not. Breaking barriers between them and art to create comfortability with museums going so that they don't think of it as a high place for creativity. And to the left here, to the right here, you see, you see a quote by dear McCleary, who we'll talk a little bit about in just a second, but I really love this quote here that he's coined. Museums have long been the deciders of what's preserved in our society. However, when did we give the institution authority over what the public should perceive as beautiful? And what does this have to do with Mario? So if you've experienced sort of a lack or depravity of resources and education like I have in the past, one of the things you would gravitate towards is some of the more accessible art forms and forms of media. And that would be sort of your creative outlet. And for me, at a very young age, video games and anime and cartoons and television, those are some of the more immediately accessible forms of art that I could reach and allow for immersion and creative expression. And specifically for video games, especially Mario 64, this little GIF that you see here, this was just one of just a few examples of the immersion and creative experience that I was able to cultivate throughout my life. And this particular gift of Mario jumping into paintings was something that was always very important for me. It meant a lot to me when I'm thinking back about my experiences with art and with institutions. I'm thinking about the ways in which I champion my own personal relationship with the arts and with creativity. And Mario's jumping into paintings in this video game here was just one very early experience where I got to have a full immersive and more holistic experience with art. And I think that really frames my experiences with art today. Because if I don't feel this drive to jump into the painting or really view the artist's inner world, it can be quite difficult for me to really connect and find the relationships. And so a lot of what I do as an interpreter and educator is really focusing on the ways in which we can cultivate a more holistic experience in the arts. And one of the ways we do that is through having conversations about world building and how there's an interconnectivity as we move forward in the discussions or tours that I give. And some of the particular barriers here, Dr. Pablo Tinio mentions creativity itself as being a bit of a barrier. We think that something has to be creative, and thus we're not worthy of participating in this act if we're not creative, right? But I also think of maybe the lack of empathy and the unawareness of power dynamics are just some of the barriers that come into play as we look at these sort of powerful, longstanding, incredible legacy institutions who are seeking diversity, equity, and inclusion, and marketability of various communities who have traditionally been shut out of access and engagement. And so thinking about environment, education, and culture were just some of the other more immediate barriers that I personally have dealt with in arts and culture and nonprofits, but also thinking about how others in my community and communities outside of the Black community would also have different relationships and barriers to connecting with the arts in a more holistic way. And in addition to that, I wanted to highlight a few artists who are also pushing beyond barriers. And what we see here as two important images here, and a quote by Lena Iris Victor. She's one of my all-time favorite artists. She says that these barriers to entry are illusory. And I wrestled with that quote for a number of years because I couldn't really make sense of it. It was something that I didn't quite understand until I encountered artists that we see here, works by Dermot Cleary, who I had mentioned previously. This is his Instagram. I highly recommend following him. He's the creator of Art Above Reality, and he's really forging his own path, something that I've learned to do quite a number of years now, forging my own path, and what he's been able to do in creating digital spaces for art and education and engagement has been very prolific. And his Patreon and Instagram have been very important hubs for creating a sort of a bridge between community and institution and education by really going his own way. And he has a number of incredible articles that really challenge the bureaucracy and the elitism within our institutions. And so I really love this sort of artistic revolutionary, if you will, which brings me to Jahan Thomas, another incredible artist. She's created this digital gallery at the Barnes Foundation here, and we can see some of her students from the Cambodian Association of Greater Philadelphia. And these are younger students who otherwise have not gotten the opportunity to display their works in a prestigious institution. And so she's created this beautiful digital gallery here to showcase their works and to give the students a great deal of confidence and excitement, knowing that their works are juxtapose the master painters, Picasso and Matisse, etc. And so these are just two incredible artists who have forged their own paths, who are pushing boundaries and barriers here, who are artists, educators, and activists, and have really taken their journeys outside of the institution and still creating lanes that are useful as we relate to various communities. And we can see the importance of that reflection. Both of which are Philly-based artists reaching far and beyond outside the city. As I mentioned, I didn't have any real experience in formal in education and arts. It wasn't until last year that I had taken a 3-day intensive drawing course with Phyllis here at PAFA, and I highly recommend it. These are some of the sketches that I had done, and presented a number of challenges for me. And much like what Dr. Tinio was speaking about in the process of creating art in this mirroring and this cyclical sort of process, I came into my own realizations and sort of holistic understandings as I'm also now in the role of an art maker in this 3-day intensive. And so this presented a number of challenges within me that I realized could apply throughout life in general. And so what we have here through my first art class is to not be afraid to take up space in life and on the page. When in doubt, let intuition out. There are times where I stumbled and I got quite caught up in a particular system or particular method, and being able to allow the intuition to really carry me forward into something new, and creating space where there's this sort of unknown aspect to my way of thinking that will actually help to facilitate an understanding. Always allow yourself to take a step back and see the big picture. These were things that I was literally grappling with the large canvas throughout this drawing intensive, but it really brought about an important element of why it's so important for artistic and creative expression at a very early age. We also have It's All Right, Take Your Time and Reflect. Like I mentioned before, a lot of what I like to do is really focus on the inner world of the arts. And so through this drawing intensive, I realized how important it was for me to cultivate my relationship with creativity and with the arts more generally. And so I think it's very important that my experiences are just sort of a microcosm to a larger, more systemic occurrence that we see in various communities all across the country. And so I wanted my experiences to be sort of a drop in the ocean that reflects a larger systemic issue. And so these are just some of the experiences that I've sort of cultivated as a creator, taking up this particular mantle, and how I see our youth are very much in need of these particular outlets, and they typically find them in digital spaces today. And so looking at works by digital works by Deer and Jahan, who are thinking more forward in the future about these digital gallery spaces, which are more common nowadays. I think having these more formal and educational spaces allows for this reflection. It allows for this larger understanding, this larger, more internalized experience that I think is important, that carries with us forward. And so these are just some of the experiences that really resonated with me. Also, lastly, there are no mistakes in art nor in life. These are just some of the philosophies that came to mind as I grapple with this experience. And then here are a number of works that throughout the years have been very inspirational to me. As we see in the top center here, Lena Iris Victor, is Barriers to Entry are Illusory. She's one of my favorite artists. And so we see a number of artists here who have works that really speak to my particular way of looking at the art and my relationship with the arts here. I can go on and on about these artists and their works and their practices, but I just wanted to highlight them and showcase the beauty and their ability to create this world that you just want to jump in and be a part of. like Mario. And so I think it's important to create and continue to have those relationships at any age in life. And so I'm very blessed to have found this particular relationship in art, not just as an art observer, but as an art interpreter and educator as well. And so we have a number of incredible works here that really speak to the importance of finding that inner creativity. And with that, I want to thank you all. This has been a great conversation, and I look forward to any other questions or comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dennis. Really powerful. Hit home, especially for me as the father of a 13-year-old who also loves Mario. And I may just steal some of those ideas to try to help him connect better with, more deeply with art in ways that his father would like to see him connecting. Terrific. Well, thank you. We have had two really fascinating and rich presentations, and I'd like to begin our conversation portion of our time. Pablo, I'd like to begin with you, to invite you to comment on what Dennis just shared with us. Based on your experience as a researcher, what strikes you as particularly valuable or interesting or insightful in the work that he's presenting?
Thank you, James. And Dennis, thank you. That's some personal things you've shared there. I love the sketches. They're awesome. Thanks for sharing them. I think let me focus on the one word that Dennis mentioned a few times, which is barriers, right? And I think museums, the last two decades or so, they've really tried to open things up. Whether it was, shifting focus from the collection to the audience, to the customers, right, to the visitors, and really, part of the last few years, especially with the DEI movement, DEI focus, museums are still struggling. I mean, they really are struggling, and that word barrier is so powerful. It's such a nice way of trying to explain why they're struggling. Museums are not comfortable places for many people. And we know this, and some people might not want to hear it. They're really not. So if you grew up going to your parents taking you to museum, like I have two kids, I take them to museums since they were young. That's like a thing that we do, right? Thing that we've done over the years. So when we say let's go to a museum, it's like, okay, which one, right? For a lot of people, the closest experience that they've had was hope. And a lot of people don't get this experience even, is let's say a school field trip to a museum, which is a significant event. So if I've worked with many ed departments in museums and their, school programs. That's a big to do. Buses have to be rented, students have to be brought to the museum, they have to be chaperoned for a few hours in there, taught how to kind of like behave in a museum. So I think that idea of barrier really, really resonated with me, because it really is something that I still see in pretty much every museum I walk into, is that not everybody's comfortable. It's not, you go to buy tickets to see a movie, and you walk in, you know what to do. You show the ticket, you find the theater, you sit down, you find your seat, whatever, buy some popcorn before. But there is a sense of it's a very formal place. We know this. And there's almost this unwritten kind of set of rules where this is how you do museums. You don't speak loudly, right? You certainly don't touch anything. You don't get too close, and all these things. So for a lot of people, it's kind of like that's unfamiliar, right? It's an unfamiliar environment. So when I said that museums are struggling, I think part of it is like they as much as they've opened up over the years, they're still not visitor centered. They're not. And as a researcher, that's reflected in some of the research that we've done over the years as well. What do we typically do in a typical museum study? Let's say we actually step out of the lab and not show images on a screen, but let's say we're in a museum. We typically pick a few works that the researcher believes would be good stimuli, right, for that study. And we ask people to tell us what they, give them a sheet of paper or an iPad, and we have questions, predetermined questions, with answers that we expect. And that's how we honor their voice, but we're not honoring their voice in that situation. So I think the overlap with the work that Dennis has presented, or the presentation and the research that I presented today is really that. It's like Zorana and I, when we designed the study, we wanted to honor the voices of the visitors. No time limit. We only prompted them if they were struggling to speak, and we asked them, pick a work and think out loud about that work. And we're going to analyze the data based on those, what you thought, what you said, what you saw, what you felt, and so forth. And are we successful in kind of censoring the visitor? I think partially, but not fully, obviously. And that's where the work is. It is like the future work that we're doing is like, how do we do this better? And how do we really keep the visitor at the center, even more? So there's that overlap between the struggles of the museum with the struggles of the researchers.
Yeah, thank you, Pablo. Dennis, I'm curious, given what Pablo just said, and then harking back to his presentation in terms of the study and the goals of empirical aesthetics, and especially more recently, trying to move toward, as Pablo said, more meaningful kinds of outcomes and objects of study. I'm curious, as you were hearing him present his study with the Think Aloud, the method, and trying to get into the experiences of the individuals in the art museum. How do you see that, or how do you hear that from your frames in terms of the questions of barriers and other kinds of things that you brought up in your presentation?
Yeah, thank you. I hear that quite a bit, and oftentimes in the uncertainty. And so I completely agree. Yeah, there is a level of uncomfortability as you're entering museums. Maybe if it's your first time, I think it sort of presents, you sort of have to chip away at the sort of insecurity and really allow that space for folks to feel comfortable sharing. And so it's been my experience that you have to really pull back from and allow space for the students to really respond and to really think. I think also it can be a great deal of pressure for folks to really think about the works, especially if they're given a sort of a time constraint. But I really do like, especially in relation to your presentation, where you're thinking about allowing the students to pull from any number of works, and sort of not really limiting the students' responses or options. And so I think that creates just a space for them to be a bit more open and to really interpret things from their own perspective. If we're just limiting their scope to maybe some of the more fine arts works, and maybe ignoring some of the more sculptural or contemporary works, I think we're doing them a bit of a disservice. So oftentimes I find there's a need to really continually emphasize the importance of the sort of unrestricted access to our collection and to the conversation. And so that's usually what comes to the forefront.
Yeah, terrific, Dennis. Just building on that, Pablo, did you, I think you said the sample size was 70, if I recall correctly. Do you have any kind of demographic differences? Were there people that were first-time museum goers versus people who basically lived at the museum? Were there people who were perhaps, from different demographic groups, or is whether or not you were able to do that in this initial study, is this something that is of interest to you? And what thoughts do you have about, or expectations that you might have about, the differences in those narratives from someone who, like your kids, kind of are growing up in museums versus somebody like maybe some of the folks that Dennis works with who maybe, still really feel those barriers to art museums?
Right, absolutely. So we did collect demographic data. We haven't analyzed obviously there's only 70 visitors and didn't want to put too much emphasis on those yet, but we have a plan for a bigger project where it's a bigger sample size. And but again, it's tricky. As soon as you start, for example, like selecting strategically, then you're losing out on people who might otherwise be, you know, they might have something to say that is important. It's always important, but in terms of like that individual in the museum, it's a typical New York City sample. It really is. With the data that we have, highly educated or educated, college degree, at least a bachelor's degree for most of the participants. And most were repeat museum visitors. I think it was 3 or more museum visits within that given year to a New York City museum, but most were repeat visitors to the Whitney Museum. So it fairly, most of them were knowledgeable of what was sort of how to behave in a museum, what to do, how to approach it. And most had some knowledge. So visitors talked about, oh, like I haven't seen this one from Hopper, or I haven't seen this in for so long. I saw it 20 years ago or whenever. So yeah, they do have that background experience. We'd like to do a similar study. I did something similar at the Queen's Museum many years ago with Ava Specker. And typically with Queen's Museum, it's because of the type of art that they show and the location, you do kind of have a different audience as compared to, let's say, the Whitney or the Metropolitan Museum. But yeah, we have that's definitely of interest to us, but we are always careful in terms of now are we now putting more researcher constraints in the sampling itself in a just like with the research design, other aspects of the research design.
Pablo, do you think that that same research design, or let me put it differently, that same process as a part of the study that currently is designed for research, do you think that there are aspects of that that could be designed for practice or used
Yes.
for practice, right? Could you say something about how Dennis, perhaps, or people like Dennis in that more applied domain might be able to use some of the techniques or approaches that you've used in research for their practice?
Yes, absolutely. So we actually worked with the Phillips collection in DC. This was summer of was it this summer? I can't remember now. Summer of 2022. It was part of the Empathy Summit, Designing for Empathy Summit. It's a conference for museum practitioners, and we ran a workshop. It was a like 2-hour workshop at the Phillips collection, where we put them through an experience of looking at art and engaging with artworks that within the sort of the tenets and the claims of the mirror model. So we had them go through kind of peeling layers of materials as they were looking at the painting, and had them talk about sort of that experience until we got to the point of having them ask questions about the artist, the intentions, motivation for the work, what the world was like at that time the piece was created. So yes, there is that scaffolded sort of process of experiencing art, but also you have to create the space for it, both physically and temporally. So that was a 1 hour, 2 hour session, right? That's not the time that folks have typically, and museums will devote to having these experiences because typically it's like super quick. 30 minutes here, you observe this, sketch it, and so forth with art education work. Granted, those are powerful experiences, but when you slow it down and really go through the steps, we found that it is effective in engaging people and having that sort of conversation with the artist through the artwork. So there is that applied aspect to it.
And do you find that there's maybe better results or more varied results when if there's a continued series of studies that's done as opposed to maybe a summit or a one-off event?
And that's an open question. That's an interesting question, actually. So what would happen if you kind of do it long term or longish term? these experiences versus the quick one-offs that we typically do? That's a good question, Dennis. I'm gonna write that down.
Because I'm curious about that from
Yeah,
from
right.
a programming standpoint, creating a series of conversations. And so I'll be doing this in December, and like I've done before, we've created a series of recurring conversations that really continue to unpack a particular theme or subject matter. So I'm always curious about how what a recurring structure or series
Right.
would look like.
And Dennis, I want to go back to the Mario GIF for a moment, because one of the things that my son loves to do, not only play Mario, but also watch other people playing Mario, right? So it's kind of like Pablo's study. It's think aloud as you're playing the video game, right? And so you didn't have a sound on that GIF, but if it were one of those people playing, they would be like, oh, now I got to jump over the barrier. Oh my goodness, look out. Oh, there's a painting. Yeah, let me jump in. So I'm curious whether that kind of a model in some of the populations and individuals that you work with, do you think there would be a receptivity to either observing, like you could be the video player who's saying, look, as I'm looking at this art, let me say aloud what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, as others are around you who may be there for the first time, not to tell them what the truth is or what they should think, but just as modeling, here's one way of encountering. And then now it's your turn, right? So what do you like? Are there things here that could be used in that kind of an applied sense, do you think?
Absolutely. Now, I've actually applied this to my visitor experience staff. So I oversee a staff of 5 VEAs. And one of the things that we incorporate into our training is that particular model of taking turns interpreting the works here, but also thinking about our relationships between the relationships between various works of art that we're moving through. But my experience at the Barnes Foundation, we would typically administer a number of iPods for young kids, and they were actually able to play a particular art game that was created by Drexel University for the Barnes Foundation, where they replicated the Barnes collection, and you play as a character that you can create in this world, and they're running around and experiencing the collection in a more interactive way. I would like to continue an approach similar to that, where we take this more interactive idea and incorporate the collection to that. But I'm really curious to know what we could do with that. But yeah, in my experience, that has worked from a professional standpoint, but also from a consumer-based visitorship as well.
Yeah, it's terrific, Dennis. I think one of the things, Pablo, that you were talking about, the kind of uneasiness that we have oftentimes in art museums, is I think it's unclear how we're supposed to interact. And I know, my son really likes interactive things. He doesn't just want to go in and hear a lecture. He wants to, get involved in some kind of a way. And certainly when you go into an art museum, there's a lot of interactivity that's happening, hopefully, but oftentimes it's invisible, it's silent. You can't really be like, oh my goodness, that's how this person is, And so finding ways, I love the idea, the game that kids can kind of begin to get connected in, and that interactivity. I want to pick up on a second theme that I think, in addition to barriers, I've heard each of you talk about, and that is time. Slowing down, taking the time to have these things happen. And certainly, Pablo, in your research, it takes time to create works of art, and it takes time to engage with and to observe and really get to that point where you're really connecting with that work of art. And Dennis, I know that part of what you're talking about here is, and part of what you learned from your initial course, and is part of what guides you in your interaction with art, is slow down, don't hurry, take your time with things. I'm just curious if each of you would comment on what you think is so important about that slowing down. What are some effective methods of slowing down, and maybe what's something you heard in the other person's presentation that sparks maybe a new way for you to think about the process or importance of slowing down?
I can go first because I wanted to, Dennis, you mentioned the jumping into the painting with Mario going into it. I love that, that image. Jeff Smith, who was in one of the sessions a few months ago, we're writing a book called Personal Connoisseurship. This is with David Bell, so there's 3 authors. And we kind of talk about that, and that's, I would say, the underlying idea, right, of this book, jumping into the painting, personal connoisseurship, essentially how you bring yourself into the work, right? And that requires time. So what we're writing about is this idea of bringing yourself into the work, giving yourself the time and the space to really, to not only try to interpret what you're seeing, but also try to interpret what you're seeing in terms of what you're experiencing at the moment and what you've experienced in the past, in terms of your life history. So we think that that is key, right? To getting the most out of the art experience, that art engagement, because it gives you ownership of that situation. It's not about necessarily like, what's the right way of looking at this? Am I looking at this how it's intended to be looked at by the curators? But it's more, all right, I'm looking at this painting. Who does it remind me of? If you're looking at somebody depicted, a subject in a painting, a portrait, let's say, who does it remind me of? What does it make me think about? What part of my past life kind of emerges during this process. So I love that, jumping into the painting, but the time it's a tricky bit, right? If you think about it, we know from studies that Jeff and Lisa Smith have done, a study that I did with them at the Art Institute, about 30 seconds. People spend about 30 seconds looking at masterpieces, right, of a museum's collection. And even if when you see something interesting and we watch people observe something that really catches them, it's no more than a minute, and that includes label reading. So whether, it's good or bad that we slow them down, I think it's good. It's still a logistical challenge within a museum setting. It's a logistical challenge for anything unguided, obviously. But even if it's a program, so the things that you do, Dennis, the things that programs you create, it's still not an easy sort of work. It's not easy work to slow people down and then scaffold that experience.
Yeah. Dennis, before you respond, I'm just a little note here. Catherine, I'm going to put you on the spot after Dennis has replied to say something about our research on immersion, which I think ties in here really well. And then after that, we'll open it up to anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment. So feel free, either in the chat or you can raise your Zoom hand and we'll call on you to make a contribution. Okay, Dennis, back to you.
Yeah. And so, yeah, like one of the things that I think quite frequently about is how differently we all think about time, and we all have a very different relationship with time, especially as it relates to arts and the engagement in the arts. And so I completely agree. One of the challenges is I want to really engage in more slow looking at art, which is what we more commonly that we discuss quite frequently as we talk about engagement and immersion in art. As you're dealing with groups of individuals all having their different, their own personal relationships with time, it presents a number of challenges. And then we are, of course, restricted by deadlines and timelines and things of that nature. So it can be quite a bit of a challenge, but I do like a bit of a slow roast when it comes to dissecting the works that we're engaging with. It's something that I like to incorporate in my works quite frequently. I'm pretty well known for this discussion, especially as I'm interacting with a more younger audience. It poses a number of challenges because their attention spans can be all over the place. But I do think a lot about the importance of that moment of time to have that reflection. And for me, it may take a bit of a moment to get to really sort of think about my experiences, as Dr. Tinio had mentioned, thinking about your experience up close and personal with an artwork, and then forming sentences and words around that experience to describe what I'm feeling and thinking about. And so I know that can be very different for each individual. And so I try to remain cognizant of that, but I do always like to make space for interjection and inclusion in that conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Dennis. Catherine, I know that you've been spearheading work with the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project that in part is empirically testing our conceptual model in which we hypothesize and argue that immersion is really an important part of what allows for benefits of art engagement. Curious if you could just give us a brief overview of some of that work.
Sure. So when we're talking about immersion, at least in the context of our research, it's really about this idea of feeling kind of carried away by the work and transported into that experience and whatever that looks like for someone. So losing track of time, finding it rewarding, find it deeply engaging, essentially is how we're kind of thinking about this idea of immersion. And partially because of COVID, partially because new research tools are exciting. We've been doing a lot of this in the digital space. So looking at the kind of abundance of like virtual galleries that are coming out now, and a lot of museums are hosting, and so trying to understand these experiences, because I think they have a unique accessibility point that maybe an in-person museum visit doesn't quite have for some people. There's flexibility, there's the less social pressure. I know kind of Pablo, you talk about that socialization of how you behave and all of that in the museum. And what we've been finding is that when people are able to become immersed, they seem to take more away from their arts experiences. They tend to have more strong emotional reactions, feel more of these kind of aesthetic emotions of awe, feeling moved, sense of wonder, chills. And since we're in particular interested in well-being, they also tend to gain greater benefits from for their well-being when they're more immersed. And if we look at it over a series of visits, we've been able to do a series of short, like 15 minutes or so visits to these virtual spaces. The people who are able to get immersed and have that immersive experience also show greater well-being gains over time. So they're able to kind of reinvest and get more out of it over time. Literally very hot off the presses because it's about to get submitted to the journal. So very fresh analyses for these immersion findings. And so an interesting finding that we have though is that the length of time people are spending for the work is not predictive of their immersion level. This might be a kind of factor of the digital space and may look very different in an in-museum, in-person context. But since the kind of the conversation of slow looking came up, I just wanted to note that it didn't necessarily seem to be at least linearly related to how long people are spending with the work, but perhaps what they're doing when they're engaged with the work is helping to influence their immersion. We're going to try to dig more deeply into it. We have a little bit of qualitative data as well, and so we'll be able to see what the more immersed folks are perhaps focusing on or emphasizing during those forms of engagement.
That's
Terrific.
really,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just going to
Can't
ask
wait to read it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that because I wondered what the particular mediums were or the types of works that were there that really influences the speed at which they were immersed in the works and the impact that they got from that experience, because that's really interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm. When I was in graduate school, I had a chance to live and study for a year in Europe, and I did as much traveling as I could. And when I would get to a new city, I would find out, where am I going to stay? Where's the art museum? And I would go to the art museum, and there's so many, amazing things to take in, and overwhelming sometimes. And as I, visited more and more art museums, I found that sometimes instead of trotting through the museum and try to glance at everything, if I would choose one thing and really get to know it, that my overall experience of the art museum was actually, I was more nourished, along those lines. So fast forward to the last 10 years or so, I've been teaching a course in our Master of Applied Positive Psychology program on the humanities and human flourishing. I take my students on a field trip to the Barnes Foundation, and I say to them, look around. We have a framing of well-being. So Pablo, it's very much about, how does your well-being, your strengths, your meaning and purpose in life connect to this experience in the art museum. And then I asked them to be attentive to one particular work, much similar to what you asked your participants to do, Pablo, that really spoke to them from the standpoint of well-being, and then to go back and spend at least 20 minutes in front of that work. And this, by their report, by their anecdotal report, really transforms their experience of being in the art museum. They develop relationships. Pablo, I don't think that's too strong of a term, right? They develop relationships with these works instead of just familiarity with, glancing. And so again, fast forward a little bit further, a year or so ago, a colleague of mine, we're going to have a meeting, and he happened to know about the work that we're doing in the Humanities and the Flourishing Project. And he said to me, I actually really like art myself. And so I said, well, why don't we have our meeting, not in my office, but why don't we have our meeting at an art museum? And so we started our meeting with slow looking at a piece together. It was marvelous. It was fascinating. It taught us so much about each other. And so I personally think that museums need to sell box seats. Think about what happens at a sporting event. You take your business partner, you take your company, you buy a box seat, you buy, and then you take in the game, and you're talking with each other, you're doing business deals and so forth. I say this only partially in jest. I think that the ambiance and the opportunities at an art museum for bringing people together in ways that a coffee shop can't, or an office can't, or even the ballpark can't, could be really profound. And if we can continue to develop suggested protocols for how people might be able to negotiate this space in ways, I think it could really open up some really powerful possibilities.
James, you can call it sponsor a bench.
I love it. Perfect. I love it. Well, let me pause here and see if there are folks in the audience who would like to sponsor a bench or make a comment or ask a question about anything that's on your mind. Please either put it in the chat or feel free to raise your Zoom hand. Nicole.
Hi, thank you both so much for such wonderful and inspiring presentations and for the enriching conversation. My question is for Pablo. I'm curious if you also measured well-being constructs in your study and the relationships between each of those overarching themes and well-being outcomes. And I'm also curious if, in a follow-up, how participants' experiences would differ if maybe there was one group that was primed to go in thinking about those overarching themes, and then one group that had that more open-ended prompt.
Your first question, if I could address that, we have something similar planned for a follow-up study. It's actually a much larger project that we just submitted a few months ago. Hopefully it gets funded, then we can do something like that. But for this one, we did not measure well-being. We did demographic information, art knowledge, just the typical sort of post-study measures. But your second point is really fascinating, and that's something we've never actually thought about. Thank you for suggesting that. To what you're saying is essentially prime visitors before they experience art on those 5 themes, I guess one of the 5 themes, and see what the results of that priming, what they will be. Yeah, that's super fascinating. I actually don't know. We've done priming studies in the laboratory setting, but not in that way. Not one where the primes themselves are coming from a previous study and then doing that same study, the priming study, in the same context. Essentially, we'd want to do it at the Whitney as well, right? So I will remember this, Nicole, and I'll remember you that you suggested this in case we do something about it. I need to think about it. It's such an interesting idea. Thank you.
Would that be like considered a control group?
Yeah, you would assign, it would just be an experiment. So like 5 groups, or even 3, if you pick 3 of the 5 themes, so it's more manageable. And then have a control group 1 or 2 where they're not given the theme, and then one where they're given something else that is just not one of the themes. So like a minimum like 5 groups if we're not
That's
using all.
really interesting.
If we have funding, then it would be 7 groups.
And Pablo, although we don't have, we don't do this as a research study, there's a sense in which the students in my class that I mentioned are primed, not necessarily with one of these 5 themes, but with their study of well-being. And
Right.
so I think it would be interesting also to think about, are there well-being prompts that could be given to individuals going in as you begin to look at some of those well-being outcomes? Clearly, this is not, clearly people's experience is different. And so just like, you have different outcomes and different purposes for doing anything in life. So I think it could be interesting, and what we're all trying to move toward is a world in which we have more knowledge about the nuanced expected outcomes of different ways. You go into an art museum for different kinds of things. And so it might be interesting to see what kinds of well-being outcomes are typical from different kinds of well-being prompts, or et cetera. Right?
Oh, absolutely. In the end, we want to be able to create context that promotes well-being, right? So like all of these studies, even though for what I presented today is very open, and back here it's still predictive. How do we predict behavior, which is the point of what we're doing, given what the inputs are.
Yeah, terrific.
And I also think about like the specific types of, or just specific elements of well-being as well. I tend to take a more holistic and more philosophical approach, and that promotes a great emotional experience, but others may have a different sort of experience and perspective from well-being. So I'm curious about that as well, to what extent one has an experience with well-being, especially when it's connecting with various works of art. So I'm really curious about that as well.
So Pablo, hurry up and do your research and let us know what.
Oh yeah,
together to get some funding.
I guess Nicole is the co-author in that as well too then, right?
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question or comment if somebody would like to raise their Zoom hand and chime in. Alina.
Hi everyone, my name is Alina and I'm a research coordinator with Humanities and Human Flourishing project. Thank you so much for wonderful conversations. It's really enticing information. And I have a question to Pablo. And I'm just wondering if you probably, like, if you looked at potential differences between genders and how people look at art, or like if there is just any relevant research. Thank you.
We have not looked at that in this study, but we do know that at least in New York City museums over the years and many studies that we've done is typically the time of day we collect data. If you do it during the daytime, you're going to have more participants who are going to report female. And that's just kind of like a fact. I don't know what it is, but that's what we find. We have a lot of a history in empirical aesthetics of analyzing data based on gender. But most of those are lab studies. One of the issues with museum studies, the sample sizes are generally not big enough, or to really get reliable results based on gender. Same thing with race, ethnicity. It's very tricky. You can always analyze the data in those terms, in those categories, but whether it's reliable and the subsamples are roughly equal, generally it makes it very challenging. Thank you, though, Alina. Thanks for the question.
Sarah, one more. Go for it.
It was like, I think we have a little bit of time left. So this is a question for Dennis. Dennis, I really loved that you included creative practice with it, like as part of this world and as part of your framework that you were bringing to your work. And so I'm curious, particularly because it seems like this creative practice is new, how, if at all, it's informed the work that you're doing at PAFA, or with I guess more like, because art museums and arts orgs, the ones that you're talking about specifically, are much more receptively based. It's much more about kind of art viewing as opposed to art making. And so I am curious about how your creative practice might inform the ways in which you do community building practice or, visitor practice?
Great question, Sarah. Thanks. No, it definitely informs my practice very well. I can recall my series I'd done with the Blues Babe Foundation, which is created by Jill Scott, who I had showcased in the presentation. She's an incredible jazz singer and poet. Many of the students in the Blues Babe Foundation are creatives in their own way, and thinking about the works that we're discussing throughout the tours, I'm sort of drawing on my personal experience, but also sifting out some of their personal experience, pulling out some of their personal experience, and allowing them to share as well. And so I think as I talk more about the creative process or the potential process the artist has undergone to create the body of work, I think that gets them thinking more about the mechanical parts and the execution of the work as well, which is something I hadn't considered previously. But I noticed that there's a higher level of engagement when I challenge the students to think more about that process. How is this incredible contemporary sculpture created? How do you think this animation has been created? And so I think that gets more the gears turning for them as they're now putting themselves in that role, similar to me at the time, in the role of art making, that the actual practice of creating the body of work, which is an approach I hadn't considered previously. So to your point, you're absolutely right. It does inform it very well.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah, for that great question. And believe it or not, that brings us to the end of our time together. Thanks again to Pablo Tinio and Dennis Robinson for joining us today and giving us such thoughtful presentations and such insightful answers to our questions. Feel free to add any words of thanks you would like to in the chat as well as we wrap up here. I think this was a great pairing, and it really brought out some fascinating perspectives all around. I'd also like to thank Catherine Cotter for letting me put her on the spot. And also, she's our Associate Director of Research. I'd like to thank her and Sarah Sidoti, our Associate Director of Operations of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, for all of their work behind the scenes to make this event possible. This is our final In Conversation event for this calendar year, but we are busily planning others for the next year, for our spring semester. So for more information on our upcoming sessions next year, we invite you to sign up for our free newsletter, which you can do by visiting our website. Again, Sarah's just put that link in the chat. Thank you, Sarah, at www.humanities-and-human-flourishing.org. You can also find out there much more information about the work of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. Please feel free to join us again. Feel free to pass the word along to anyone you think might be interested. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, and be well.